Hey, good afternoon, everyone. It's great to be back with you. Hopefully, you got yourself some lunch and can settle in for what I think will be a really great afternoon of some panels. I am Maura Healey, Massachusetts Attorney General, and I am so delighted to be joined by some of my favorite friends, AG Dana Nessel from Michigan, AG Josh Stein from North Carolina, AG Josh Shapiro from Pennsylvania, and AG Keith Ellison from Minnesota. Today's panel is about COVID-19, and I know that the COVID pandemic has had a profound effect on our entire way of life, our home life, our kids' life, our parents' lives, our life within our office, life within our corporation. It's an amazing, amazing, and astounding occurrence. And I think that, of all the things I thought about when I became AG, I never contemplated what it might be like to operate and work during the time of a pandemic. And so we're going to take a little bit of time this afternoon to have a discussion about the COVID pandemic, which I think has been an opportunity for us to respond as the people's lawyers to the needs of our residents and community. It's also been a time for us to pay attention in particular to vulnerable communities who needed particular help and continue to need particular help during this time. It's been an opportunity to grapple with some of the tremendous fragilities in our system, whether it's our global supply chain, ability or inability to access technology, healthcare, the true exacerbation of persistent racial disparities that have existed for hundreds of years, worsened and highlighted during this crisis. And also an opportunity to think about some of the ways in which we've been able to work together, business and government in partnership, and also think about new innovative ways. I think all of us have had the experience of pushing our offices and folks in directions that we never thought were possible. And I'm grateful, I know, to all of the folks in my office and teams across AG's offices who have been working so hard on so many fronts. So I thought I'd start exercising my privilege, I guess, as moderator, to talk a little bit about some of the work that we've been doing in my office, what that experience has been like. And then I'm going to turn it over. We're going to have a back and forth discussion with our terrific colleagues who are going to talk about some of their experiences. First of all, I would say that, like many offices, we immediately got virtual. We got hotlines set up. We wanted to be able to respond to people. We wanted to be able to work to have multilingual staff available to assist folks with a variety of issues. We set up COVID response teams within, I think, most of our offices to help work through some of these issues and think about the ways in which our offices could be responding to and being proactive about things. I'm going to focus on a couple of things in particular that we did. We spent a lot of time on workplace safety, both for purposes of stopping the spread. We had so many, of course, essential workers, not just in our grocery stores or hospitals or driving buses and trains, but also within major distribution centers and the like, and many of our, I'll call them big box stores as well, open to the public, oftentimes the only place where folks could get groceries, for example. And so we spent a lot of time on workplace safety for the sake of the workers and their protection, and also for consumer and public protection as well. And this took a lot of advocacy and a lot of work. Right away, we increased resources and set up a task force so that people could report workplace safety concerns to our office. We did this and did it successfully. I found that companies were very responsive. Sometimes it was just a matter of not understanding the rules, not having the resources in place. We contacted so many grocery stores, for example, and I have to say they were all quite responsive and taking immediate corrective action, either around PPE or plexiglass or social distancing. we worked a lot with local boards of health and state agencies to make sure that businesses were educated and were following safety protocols. We also published, my Fair Labor team published a list of resources for worker health and safety, telling them what their rights were, making sure they understood, for example, their rights under the Massachusetts Earned Sick Time Law, making sure that employers knew that as well. We really prioritized, though, I would say, getting information and resources to low-wage workers and immigrant communities. We did this because disproportionately, this is where so many of our essential workers were coming from, frankly, and they were the ones out there, and they were the ones most exposed. As you can imagine, and we've talked about this before, the importance of community partners, we literally went to food pantries, churches, to meet the community with materials in simple, clear language in probably 10 or 12 different languages so that they would understand their rights. And they would know who to call if they ran into a problem, say with an employer refusing to pay them for not showing up when they were supposed to actually be paid when they were entitled to earn sick time law, or threatening to retaliate against them by turning them into ICE, for example. We had some of those situations, those kinds of threats. People were really, really scared. We had a few instances of, down a seafood processing plant in New Bedford where the coronavirus ripped through there. And, again, it was about making sure we had the teams out there with the Board of Health to shut things down, to make sure that the corrective action was taken. We also worked directly to reach out to some of our major companies. Amazon and Whole Foods, for example, who have seen increased business, I think, through this whole pandemic. So much shopping is now occurring online. Calling on them, I'm pleased to say that we were joined by many other colleagues in that effort, and that Amazon and Whole Foods have responded in enhancing the safety measures for essential workers and providing COVID-related leave benefits, and we appreciate that. Same thing happened with Walmart, and now it's making sure that masks are available to all the workers, informing employees, as other companies are, when coworkers are diagnosed with COVID-19, and really working hard to ensure that all stores are following companies' health and safety protocols. And so those are some of the things we've done around the workplace. Again, I think this remains an important area for all of us, and hopefully an area where we can work together, businesses, employers, and offices like ours. Around the issue of resources, too, I wanted to mention that, we also worked hard on the issue of racial disparities, making sure that everyone within our office was thinking about racial disparities and how to address some of those disparities, making sure that we were encouraging our hospitals and test centers to set up in communities of color, making it easy for people to get tested, spending a lot of time, getting education and materials to people who may have been scared. Of course, so much of this has been happening against the context of threats by the Trump administration to collect people's information, their data, and then people are afraid that will be used against them. And in the meantime, if people are afraid to go to the hospital when they're sick, if they're afraid to leave their house to get tested, that really ends up contributing to the further spread potentially and further public harm. And so, spending time on that. I'd say the other area is we spent a lot of time on small businesses, and we worked to set up a pro bono with our local Chamber of Commerce to set up a program where small businesses who just weren't getting the PPP money, didn't have the lawyers or accountants on staff, may not have had the banking relationships. And really, I think small businesses are really the lifeblood of so many of our communities and local economies. And it was a real problem. And so we set up with the Chamber of Commerce a way for funds to be created to support and provide some bridge loans and outright grants, actually, to some of these businesses, and also work to give them pro bono help so that they could better apply for programs and funding, so that they could have a lawyer who might help renegotiate a lease, for example, for commercial space. We continue to spend a lot of time on this issue because small businesses, we've got over 100,000 of them in Massachusetts alone, employing so many people. And Massachusetts right now has among the highest unemployment rates in the country, which may be surprising to some, but that's just how hard we've been hit by the coronavirus. So it's a little bit about what we've been up to in the office. I now want to turn it over to my friend, Josh Stein, who is going to talk to us about some of the fantastic work that that his team has been doing. And Josh, welcome.
Absolutely, Maura. Pleasure to be with you. Pleasure to be with everybody. Wish we were in person.
Yeah, I wish we were too, especially in Philadelphia.
Happy to talk.
Cheesesteaks and whatever else.
Absolutely. Happy to give sort of an overview, but also happy to just engage with whatever conversation you would like to do.
Okay.
I mean, obviously, this pandemic has turned everything upside down. It's the greatest public health crisis we faced, deadliest health pandemic in 100 years. We've experienced the worst unemployment in 85 years. And so it's truly a double whammy. It's both a health and economic crisis. I want to thank our governor. Many of you know Roy Cooper, former Attorney General, current governor of North Carolina, and he's done an excellent job providing steady, science-based, expert-advised, and compassionate leadership through very struggling times, such that I don't want to sugarcoat it. It's bad here, just like it's bad everywhere in the country. But we have been hit much less intensely than many of our southern neighbors, which just opened the doors wide open too early without sufficient public health protections. And so one thing we've been doing is advising the governor when he makes his policy determinations. We put it into executive order form, and then we go to court to defend those orders to protect the public's health and safety. And we've had great success in doing so. But we've also been trying to acknowledge the fact that so many North Carolinians are struggling. We've had 1.2 million people file for unemployment since April. I mean, just a devastating number of people. And one thing that people don't always associate with the Office of Attorney General is we are essentially corporate counsel to the largest corporate entity in the state, which is the state. And many, many people have transactions with that entity. They owe money to the state, and we do debt collections on behalf of the state. And one thing that I did early on was announce that we wouldn't be collecting the state's debt. We are not forgiving the debt to the state. People still owe it, but we are forbearing collections because people are struggling. And I want people to focus on putting food on the table, on paying their rent so that they don't get evicted, making sure that the utilities are connected, that their cell phones are connected, the things that they need in order to provide for their families. And so we've made clear that to people that, yeah, they still owe the money, but we want them to keep their head above water, and in due time, when things have picked up, that's when we'll remind them of what they owe to the state. So that's one thing we've done.
Well, Josh, big commendations to you and, of course, to Governor Cooper. Leadership matters, and we've unfortunately, sadly, seen the difference in this time. You mentioned the debt collection work. You mentioned the economic issue, and tied to the economics is also the public health. They're inextricably linked, of course. And one of the things, as folks know, the Trump administration's been attempting to dismantle the Affordable Care Act since Trump took office, particularly galling during this pandemic. And in April, you led this coalition, I think there were 22 of us, who urged HHS to reconsider its very short-sighted decision to deny special enrollment during this pandemic. How do you think how opening exchanges could have benefited the people in North Carolina and across this country? And also you have been such a leader on looking to expand access to healthcare generally in your state. So, your thoughts on that?
Sure, happy to. I mentioned 1.2 million North Carolinians lost their jobs. Nationally, it's well over 50 million people. And what this has shown is the real risks to people's health care by having employer-based dependent insurance. So when people lose their jobs, they often lose their health insurance. Now, fortunately, if you lose your job, you can enroll on the exchange. But in North Carolina, we had 1 million people who had no health insurance, who were not on the exchange when this pandemic hit. And they understood the risks that they were taking in daily life to the extent they could have afforded insurance. Many of them simply can't. But when there is a pandemic and they know that if they catch this virus, that they run the risk of having large scale medical bills, that was precisely the moment that the DHHS secretary should have exercised his discretion to reopen enrollment to anyone who missed out in the end of 2019. So I want to thank all the colleagues who joined us in that letter. I wish that it had been successful. I wish we could have convinced this administration to care about people's health. But this, by the way, is the exact same administration that has partnered with 20 some odd Republican AGs to try to eliminate the Affordable Care Act in its entirety, both before and now currently during a health pandemic. I mean, if they succeed in the US Supreme Court where this case currently rests, and I want to thank all the states who are working on it and give particular kudos to General Becerra in California for California's leadership in this effort, but we're all arm in arm on this issue. If they win, 20 million Americans will lose their health insurance. In North Carolina, it's 500,000 people who get their insurance through the exchange. It's another 400,000 who get insurance through subsidies under the ACA, working folks who simply can't afford insurance on their own. It's another 70,000 young people under the age of 26 who cannot who are on their parents' health insurance because of the ACA. There's nearly 1.8 million seniors who get their insurance, who have lower health pharmaceutical bills by about $1,000 each because of the ACA. There are all kinds of protections that exist. Probably the most important, particularly in a pandemic where 6 million people now have experienced COVID-19, but there are 4 million North Carolinians who have a pre-existing condition. And the Affordable Care Act ensures that each one of those people cannot be discriminated against by insurance companies. And so all of that's at risk. All of that is outrageous and is really a sad testament to the partisan times in which we live.
Yeah, no, I hear you, Josh, and thank you for your leadership on that. You've also led bipartisan, though, in an area during COVID we talked a lot about is the internet and teleschooling, telemedicine, telehealth. You led a bipartisan letter, just how to get bipartisan letter, thank you, to call for Congress to fund those much needed internet resources. Talk a little bit about the importance of broadband and internet access, why you did that, where we need to go.
Yeah, I mean, it's really been underscored, the importance of internet technology, broadband. And I want to thank our colleague, Phil Weiser. Phil was a co-leader along with Generals Fox and Peterson on the R side. And we try to work in bipartisan fashion. I know we're at DAGA, but we all try to work together with fellow AGs across the political spectrum when we can. And it's unfortunate when there are instances like the ACA, which is clearly in the national interest, and yet it's been turned into a partisan issue. But broadband isn't, fortunately. So we sent the sign-on letter, and I think we had 39 states. So I thank all of the colleagues who joined us in that effort. But what we have seen in a very pronounced way because of COVID is how critical internet connection is. I actually, I won't name my provider, but my internet went down earlier. So now I'm on a hotspot. And I live in downtown Raleigh with excellent infrastructure, and I pay a lot of money for my internet, and it still goes down. Imagine we have almost more rural residents than any state other than Texas and California. I mean, we're a massive rural population, and the internet is absolutely essential to ensuring that people can get health care, that our kids can go to school. 70% of North Carolina school kids are not in school. They are doing it virtually, my daughter being one of them. And so we need the internet for education. We need it for telemedicine. Small business absolutely depends on it for connecting to the broader world, just like they depend on the postal service. And so we need the internet. And it's basically the critical infrastructure of the 21st century. And part of the government's role is to finance infrastructure for our collective benefit. And so we all sent a letter to Congress and said that they need to provide funding to stay in the next stimulus bill package, funding for state and local to expand broadband, and to expand the universal service fund for low-income folks to buy it when it's available.
Well, thank you so much for all of that. Speaking of hotspots and the like, I apologize, folks. I'm in a cruiser unexpectedly right now because I'm going to a wake for a fallen trooper in our state. But I'm really glad we can be together. And Josh, thank you for all those contributions. I know you've also done a ton of work on price gouging, which I think, is unfair to the marketplace generally and certainly unfair to consumers. Thank you for being such a great advocate and sharing those experiences with us today. And I hope you get your internet back. We're now going to go to our host. Josh Shapiro is with us. And Josh, welcome. Great to see you. We wanted to talk a little bit about, shifting some. You've really found innovative ways to partner with others outside of the office during COVID to bring relief to Pennsylvanians. So I wondered if you could talk a little bit about that, and we definitely want to get into some of the PA CARES Act initiative as well. Well, welcome.
Thanks, Maura, and I'm so sorry to hear about the loss of your trooper, and I'm glad you're exactly where you need to be. So thank you for making time for all of us in the middle of this, and it's great to see my colleagues and to follow Josh Stein. Yeah, Maura, actually early on when I was Attorney General, you showed me how important partnerships are, particularly with the private sector. You had worked on a number of important initiatives, some of which came because you convened people in a meeting. And I remember you and I had a long talk in one of those buses that Janine puts us in as we go around in one of these conferences about the power to sort of set the table and convene and have a conversation. And of course, some of them come as a result of litigation or the threat of litigation. In this case, we saw in Pennsylvania, given not just the crisis caused by the public health side of things, but the economic side of things too, that I really felt that I needed to bring the private sector in to help solve some of these problems when it comes to both workers as well as consumers. So maybe I'll just take a minute and touch on both. On the side of workers, we saw, and I know you've led a number of these efforts to protect workers at Amazon and other places, and we appreciate your leadership. We've seen in Pennsylvania so many gig workers just being left sort of bare, right? Where they didn't have the protections they needed. Hell, some of them didn't even have the basic thing as, their mask that they needed to wear. They couldn't stay home with their kids to help their kids. Some of them couldn't stay home, Keith, when they got sick, right? And they needed that protection. And so rather than suing somebody and getting into a protracted legal fight, we tried to drill down on who were the big drivers of our gig economy in Pennsylvania that had a lot of employees that those employees needed help. And we focused actually on DoorDash and Instacart, who were bringing a lot of food, to people in need, and who were also keeping restaurants alive in the midst of folks being quarantined and home. And I negotiated directly with their CEOs to try and make sure that their workers could get time off if they got sick, that there was a presumption that they had COVID. They didn't have to go out and prove that they had COVID, that they weren't going to be penalized if they stayed home to care for their health, that they would be able to stay home and care for loved ones like a kid or an elderly parent, to make sure that they would have access to telehealth, because so many of them, while they actually enjoy the ability to have flexibility in the way they earn a living, they still want healthcare coverage and they still want access to doctors and other things. And so we were able to negotiate a package directly with both companies that they then scaled up across the country in other states. And so we were particularly proud of that. And that was a way to help workers, just one example. On the consumer side, I'll mention the PA Care package, then Maura, give the floor right back over to you. You know, when we immediately hit this crisis and people had to stay home from work, unemployment numbers soared in Pennsylvania. We're a state of about 13 million people. Our workforce is about 6 million. And at the height of this, 2 million people were out of work. You know, I'm not very good at math, but that's a third of our workforce gone, wiped out. And those folks were struggling to keep food on the table, to care for their families. They were worried about losing their homes and they were worried about losing their cars because they couldn't make payments. And, you know, there was just the reality the government wasn't going to be able to solve these problems immediately. And so I actually called our biggest bank that's headquartered in Pennsylvania, a big bank nationally, named PNC, and said, look, join me in something I'm calling the Pennsylvania Care Package, where you're going to give people 90 days to not have to make a mortgage payment or a car loan or some other, loan, and give them access to low-income loans and things like that are going to help them get through this. Waive all of those annoying fees that people hate to pay. PNC stepped up and agreed to that. And so any one of their customers who were in need of that type of assistance, forbearance, what have you, they got it. And they got it without penalty. And what was amazing was over 20 other banks in Pennsylvania, some big national banks, Bank of America, and some real small local regional banks really stepped up and helped out and made a difference. And, we were hearing from, hundreds of thousands, millions of Pennsylvanians, I should say hundreds of thousands of Pennsylvanians who were getting help to the tune of millions of dollars in relief. And we're really proud of that. It just goes to show you the importance of those public-private partnerships, the importance of government reaching out to the private sector and saying, let's work together to solve problems, particularly when you're in an acute situation like we've been in with COVID. And I just think the power of partnerships is really important. So, appreciate the banks. I appreciate those gig economy companies. What it also, though, does say, and this is the last thing I'll say, Maura, is as we go forward, we've got some serious systemic problems when it comes to workforce issues, not just here in Pennsylvania, but all across the country. We've got to work together to address that. And as people come back into the economy and either get their jobs back, which look a little different today, or are looking for other jobs, we've got to make sure that they've got protections in place for them and their families. And, that's a discussion more we'll probably have in many DAGA conferences to come, but I appreciate the chance to share some of that with you.
Well, I think it's just, we love what you're doing and what you've done and trying to find a way to fill what was revealed as a much needed gap for businesses and workers. And I'm sure your program, will inform a lot going forward. Is it still going on? Are folks still able to take advantage of the program? I know business is partially reopened, but
some businesses have reopened, and of course, and what we're encouraging people to do is contact their bank directly if they're a participating bank. Anyone can go on my website, attorneygeneral.gov. By the way, that's a whole other story, how Pennsylvania ended up with the website, attorneygeneral.gov. We'll talk about that some other time. But you can go on that. You can see all the participating banks, all the participating businesses. And look, if you're here at the DAGA conference and you're a financial institution that wants to participate, we'd love to talk to you about it and involve you in our efforts.
Yeah. I want to turn to student loans, but before I do, just one question, Josh. I mean, in your conversations with the banks and the businesses, can you tell us a little bit about how they saw this and sort of the incentive, to come on board and want to provide this relief? What that was about?
Yeah. Look, I mean, I think for some of them, they were happy to be asked by the Attorney General and not, involved in some legal fight over it. And that certainly was, was part of the dynamic that they were partners in this as opposed to being dragged along. And so I think that was important. I also found that, look, a lot of these banks were pretty flush, Maura. Unlike the 2008 financial downturn, a lot of our financial institutions were in pretty good shape. And they were seeing their clients, their customers, really, really suffering. And then, of course, after our care package, they then they were put in a position to administer the PPP loan program coming from the Fed. So they had even more cash winding through their system. And so actually the CEOs I talked to, they felt that they had a responsibility to step up and do more than maybe they could have done after 2008, which obviously was a very different financial situation for them and for the country. So I found willing partners, and they were grateful to work with our office as as partners as opposed to adversaries.
Yeah, no, that's great. Josh, we got a couple minutes left here, but I thought folks would really benefit from hearing about your work around student loan assistance. I mean, people carrying student loan debt, we know, have been hard hit by this pandemic. Congress passed legislation to provide some relief, but there were millions who still didn't qualify. So talk a little bit about what your office did to provide tools to borrowers to help them find relief with student loan debt.
Yeah, look, this is such a huge issue. And Maura, you've been out front on the student debt issue. I think Massachusetts and Pennsylvania, if I'm not mistaken, are like 1-2 in the nation in terms of the per capita student debt. And so, we've worked together, obviously, on the for-profit colleges and working together on, Navient and some other things. But on this, Congress did provide some relief for people who were carrying loans, but not all. There were about 9 million Americans left out of Congress's relief package. And so we partnered with an outfit called Summer that were able to help those students who didn't qualify for federal relief get some help. And, we were able to help over 300 Pennsylvania borrowers save on average about $280 per week, which is real money. And, that was another partnership that really mattered. And by the way, full disclosure, I didn't personally take advantage of this, but I'm 47 years old. I'm still paying off my student loans. And I just sent my first kid to college a month ago. So this is an issue that affects lots of generations. We're actually seeing it more and more with senior citizens now, having bigger and bigger student debt burdens. Folks don't talk about it, but it's a serious issue. And again, I think the partnership with Summer was important as somewhat of a patchwork to get through this crisis. But boy, we've got to have a much broader conversation about how to deal with student debt in this country.
I hear you. Well, thank you for the great work on that. I know there's more of that work on behalf of students as we move forward. Great to see you. Thank you again for hosting all of us.
Yeah. I wish I could get you a cheesesteak, Maura. Here's a fun fact about Maura Healey, by the way. She played basketball for some college up in Massachusetts, not to be named, but she played at the Palestra, right, Maura?
My favorite place to play.
That's right.
The home of Carl Racine.
The same court where Carl Racine played. That's exactly right.
Yeah.
And I want you to know, I was celebrating last night when your Celtics lost. Even though the Sixers are out of it, I just still hate the Celtics so much.
I know. We are. I love you, but and that's part of the love of the relationship.
There you go.
Sixer-Celtic rivalry. Well,
That's
good
right.
to see you. We're gonna move now to General Nessel. Dana, great to see you in the great state of Michigan. You've been doing great stuff on so many fronts. You've got voting, elections, you've got protests, you've got, of course, for months now, the devastating effects of COVID. So, I want to open it up to you now to share. One thing I can't help myself, and it's a segue from Josh's commentary, education, right? Betsy DeVos. Nobody's been out there harder against her than you. You know what she's been trying to do to education. And will you kick us off by talking a little bit about, all of your terrific advocacy when it comes to education right now in this time?
Well, thanks, A.G. Healey. I have to say that for those of us in Michigan who have suffered for years under Betsy DeVos and her family and the influence that she's wielded over the legislature here, and watching how our public education system in Michigan has just been absolutely decimated solely because of Betsy DeVos and her family. No group of people was more upset than when she was actually confirmed as the Secretary of Education than those of us here in Michigan, because we knew what she intended to do was to do the same thing to public education all around the United States that she had done to us in our state. And unfortunately, that's exactly what she's done. And I will say one of the big reasons that I wanted to run for Attorney General in the first place was because I saw the amazing work that the Democratic Attorneys General were doing in terms of fighting against Betsy DeVos and all of the terrible moves that she has made in the Department of Education, defrauding student loan borrowers again, and hurting public school kids all over the nation. And I think you heard her say actually during the course of her confirmation hearings that she had never even stepped foot in a public school, not even once prior to being confirmed as the Secretary of Education. And when would that happen except for in the Trump administration? So there have been a number of lawsuits that I know that many Democratic AGs have joined in and won during the course of her time in office. And I was really proud to be able to co-lead with California, with AG Becerra, in a coalition of states that sued her once again in regard to something really disturbing that she did over the course of the summer. And that was when the CARES Act was passed, there was some $13 billion that was to be distributed across the states in accordance with Title I, so that money would go to low-income students all around the country, and specifically it was supposed to target COVID-related concerns. So that would be things like for low-income students that would not be able to learn remotely because they did not have access to the internet. They needed a hotspot. They needed an iPad or a Chromebook. Or if they were doing, in-school learning, then they needed money for proper PPE to protect those children and educators in their schools. But of course, Betsy DeVos decided to issue a rule doing exactly what she does best, which was to illegally divert money away from low-income students and from public schools to wealthier students in private schools. And so she issued this rule that was completely contrary to the plain language of the CARES Act, as well as to the intent, the legislative intent of the act. So we brought suit. A number of Democratic AGs joined us in that process. We very quickly were able to get injunctive relief so that money was not wrongfully distributed. And actually, just yesterday, we discovered that in the DC circuit, there was a grant of summary judgment in favor of the plaintiffs on that matter, and that the interim rule was vacated. And then if you actually check the Department of Education's website now, they very specifically have indicated that the rule apparently is no longer in effect. So I would call that a win. And it's so crucially important because, as we've talked about with kids going back to school, if we don't have the proper types of learning facilities for low-income kids, they're just not going to learn at all. And that was the entire purpose of the distribution of these funds to begin with. So I'm really, proud of that effort and happy about what we see as the outcome of that effort. I would say it's the last time we were going to have to sue the Department of Education while Betsy DeVos is in there, but unfortunately, I very much doubt it. But, obviously we're happy that that money will go to the places that it is most needed and the places where it was legally intended to go.
Well, thank you, General Nessel, for your leadership, and for General Becerra's effort on that front too. I mean, given the pandemic exposing the existing wealth disparities that exist, so important to be fighting against efforts to take funding away from the educational needs of public school students. So a win's a win. We'll take it, and I know you'll keep us after it. I want to shift now and talk about something that I know folks would be interested in. Michigan has also sort of been ground zero for a number, really unprecedented number, it seems, of protests in response to public safety measures, shutdown orders in particular. You've seen armed militia groups protesting at the state capitol. And can you just talk to us about, how you've been dealing with this and how you try to balance First Amendment freedoms with public safety? And, what's it been like to push for public safety measures, doing your job, when the president and his supporters have been so vocally and sometimes physically opposed, aggressively to such efforts?
Well, honestly, AG Healey, it's been very difficult. Here we are in the midst of, this global pandemic, certainly the worst of any type of situation that I think any of us who are on today can recall during our lifetimes. And that's bad enough, right? That's hard enough to have to deal with. But on top of it, to have a president who is behaving in a way that he's actually inciting violence, violence against other residents of our states, and violence against government officials in particular. So I will tell you that, back in the spring, President Trump came to Michigan. He visited a Ford plant literally right after that plant had opened. We had an executive order in place by the governor that people were to wear masks whenever they were in manufacturing facilities. Ford themselves had a policy. And I had seen that President Trump, wherever you saw him, he was never wearing a mask. And I very politely penned a letter to him, just sort of informing him what the law was in Michigan and asking him to be so kind as to be concerned about the people at that plant and to make certain that he abided by our state law, which, clearly to the president, he needed to engage in an act of defiance, because God forbid he should actually obey the laws of our state. And be concerned about people who he was in proximity to. So, of course, he acted like a petulant child, refused to wear a mask. And then, the thing that was so upsetting to me is I thought, well, people were widely complying with the mask mandate, which we all know at this point is so incredibly important in terms of containing the spread of COVID, not just because it's so much harder to get infected if you're wearing a mask, but even the severity of your infection will not be as bad, even if you catch it, if you're wearing a mask. We know this scientifically. But in the meantime, not only does he do that, but then, in response to our governor's executive orders, he tweets out, "Liberate Michigan." And he starts to incite some burgeoning militia groups and white supremacy groups to then storm the Capitol in response. And you might have seen the pictures of armed gunmen, hundreds of them carrying military-grade weapons, first of all, trying to storm onto the floor of the House of Representatives and going into the gallery of the Senate while the Senate was in session, hovering over them, masked gunmen carrying assault weapons. And, obviously this is hardly helpful. In response, I asked the Capitol Commission if they would consider banning guns. I issued an official AG opinion indicating, one, that they constitutionally could do so, that I thought it was a moral imperative, and that my department would defend them in the event that they got sued for any reason. And, they're meeting on Monday to make a determination if they're going to do it or not. This seems to me like about the easiest decision you could possibly imagine. But unfortunately, I don't have great faith and confidence that they're going to actually do it. And I will say one other thing in terms of the impact that Trump's statements have had. We had sheriffs all over the state saying that they refuse to enforce the governor's executive orders because the president said that they didn't have to. And I mean, that makes it very difficult from a law enforcement standpoint to enforce these laws and to be the attorney general in this state telling the sheriffs these are constitutional orders. Every court, both in state court and in federal court, who is evaluating these orders have found them to be constitutional. And we know they're important for public health and safety, but to have the president saying, no, you don't have to do that. It puts us in a very difficult position, and it makes it very hard for us to enforce these important orders, which we absolutely know help contain the spread of COVID in our state. So that has been a challenge, but we're working as hard as we can to enforce those orders.
Well, Dana, thank you so much. And I know, you have continued concern about protesters, militia groups and the like, and we're moving into a really heightened time here with elections. So we wish you the very, very best. And thank you for standing strong on behalf of people in Michigan. So thank you for that. We're going to move to your neighbor now, sort of. General Keith Ellison is with us. Keith, I want to say we all admire the work that you've done. You were, right early on, finding yourself in the position of the double whammy of coronavirus and then, George Floyd and all that's followed in that cauldron. And, just thank you for being such a steady leader among all of us and always doing the right thing. And, speaking of doing the right thing, I think one thing I really admire is watching you through the coronavirus, really look out for vulnerable communities. I wanted to have you talk to us a little bit about housing, which I know you're really concerned about. What have you been doing to deal with evictions, foreclosures, keeping people safe and in their homes?
Thanks for that question, Maura, and thanks for you and all the work that you do, and Josh and both Josh and Shapiro and Stein. And Dana, thank you for looking after my family. I was born and raised in Michigan. And, I remember when Corona was really spiking and you were out there fighting for people. My family and I really admired you, and thank you for it. So, look, as of this morning, we've seen around 13. We've had about 13,000 people facing. 1,300 people who have been evicted, facing eviction in the state of Minnesota. We've filed a lot of actions on behalf of a lot of people to keep them in their house. The good news is that most landlords are cooperating and working with tenants. They know people don't have the kind of money that they had before. They know that money is tighter than it was before. So we're grateful for those landlords, but there have been some occasions where landlords have taken some really inappropriate actions. We had to file a case today. We have actually been able to negotiate and work with most people, but several of the cases have gone to court. And in those cases, we have sought relief, starting with letting people stay in their housing based on the eviction moratorium governor's order. But also in some cases, we've had to get even more relief than that. There have been a few occasions where landlords have said, I'm going to cut off your utilities. We're going to cut off utilities where there's vulnerable adults and children in the household. And so we've had to really step up and take some aggressive action. As you know, most people understand that society is a social contract. There's no way that police and prosecutors and attorneys generals can make everybody obey themselves if everybody decides not to do the right thing. But most people have done the right thing, but in some cases, we have not seen that, and we've had to step up and deal with a lot of things. Again, 1,300 reports, 1,300 letters, 1,300 occasions where we've had to give legal advice, and only a few where we've had to take people to court. But in those cases, those particular cases have been pretty egregious, and And so we've had to be aggressive there. Let me tell you, despite all of our efforts, we're seeing dramatic increases in homelessness in Minnesota. If you were to visit Minneapolis, St. Paul, you drive by our public parks, places of recreation, places where the public gets to come and, see the green grass, walk around, whatever. We now see tents where people are living, not to camp out, but as a residence. And I bet you're seeing it all over the country. In Philadelphia, I saw it when I was in Detroit recently. Wouldn't be surprised if you have it in Raleigh and in Boston and various places. It's a real issue. We are seeing an already tight housing situation before COVID get dramatically worse as people see their unemployment benefits run out, as they lose their work. We've been a part of every single executive order that the governor has issued, including the executive orders regarding the housing moratorium. And we've been very, very pleased to be able to continue to refine it and improve it. And we're going to continue to do that. We believe we need a major investment in housing nationally and certainly in the state of Minnesota. One of the things that I got from Josh Shapiro is that I read an article about how he had convened a group of lenders and decided that, imitation is the sincerest form of flattery, right? So I called up Josh, got some ideas, and then we reached out to the whole range of lenders in our state, and we're able to get around 35 lenders to come together and agree to certain things. I did need to employ the help of the Federal Reserve of Minneapolis president. His name is Neil Kashkari, great guy, stepped up, helped out. The governor, lieutenant governor were helpful as well. And we got an agreement between all of the banks, including a 90-day forbearance period for customers facing financial hardship caused by COVID. Customers accessing forbearance would not be required to make a lump sum payment at the end of the forbearance. There would be an extension of the amortization period, and there would be no late fees or negative credit reports for customers. We know that people are still struggling. We know the problem is getting worse, but those are just a few things that we're working on.
Well, that's really, really extensive, and we thank you for all you're doing on that front. And I know as we're going to see moratoriums expire, I think the numbers and the concerns you raise about homelessness and housing insecurity are only going to increase. And I hear and echo your cry for help from the federal government. Our states cannot handle this alone. Keith, I want to shift gears and talk a little bit about just have you take a minute or two to comment on protests in the pandemic. And we've seen, and we may see again with elections coming, there'll be more people out there. How do you look at this? How do you encourage people to stay safe and healthy during these times, but also be able to exercise and express their First Amendment rights to demonstrate? How do we navigate this?
Yeah, well, we've had quite a lot of public demonstration. We didn't have the scale that Dana had to deal with in Michigan, but we did have very similar protests at the governor's mansion, at the Capitol, things like that. And then when George Floyd occurred, we had massive protests all over Minneapolis. And so you had people from diverse political opinions taken to the streets. And what can we do to encourage them to be safe? Wear a mask, socially distance, wash your hands, don't hug and hang on to people. And so we've been doing that. When it comes to other gatherings, we actually have had to intervene and say, if you're threatening to deliberately violate the governor's order, we may take action. We've talked a lot of people off a ledge with that kind of behavior. When it comes to the First Amendment, so you got gatherings, right? And some of our political, some are essentially commercial or recreational. In the commercial recreational ones, we just enforce the governor's order. In the First Amendment ones, we give advice, we issue advice, we try to tell people what their requirements are going to be. But at the same time, we're not in a position to walk through the crowd and issue tickets to people who are violating the order. In some ways, I wish we were, but It's just not possible.
Mhm.
And you know, we work with law enforcement. We make sure they know that they can investigate and cite people. There have been a number of cases. Those cases are within the, if they're of a criminal nature, because violation of a governor's order is a misdemeanor. It's a local police prosecutor matter. Some of those have been referred to us. We step up and help when we can, particularly when it comes to advising on the policy. But we have had some very serious issues with protesting around here, and we continue to do so. Tomorrow is the omnibus hearing, you know, the pretrial hearing on George Floyd, and we're expecting a big crowd. We have been very clear: do not get yourself sick by exposing yourself, and you know, by all means, voice your opinion, but do it in a way that does not expose you or other people. That has been the tools that we have.
Yep. Well, listen, we hope that and pray that things go all right tomorrow, and we'll continue to watch what's happening. And really thank you for coming on, and thank you for sharing, and for the great work that you're doing. I want to open it up now. We've got a little bit of time left for questions from the audience. So the DAGA team is going to help us do that. And I'm going to start with a few just in my own capacity here. So what do you think about, open up to all of you, you know, we've got this election coming. What do you think we need as states to make sure that voters are protected and safe when voting this fall? And, you know, also, what have some of you seen in terms of efforts to, how this pandemic is playing out in terms of efforts to either discourage voting or affect voting? Talk a little bit about what we're seeing here with 6 weeks to go.
I'll take a first stab simply because North Carolina has been in the news for some of the wrong reasons. The president has been here twice in the last week, and in 3 instances, he has advised voters to mail in their absentee vote and then go vote in person. Mm-hmm. And that's a felony in North Carolina. It is absolutely terrible, wrong-headed advice. And it's also Carolina, anyone who wants to vote by mail can. This was a change that was made 20 years ago. And so all you have to do is request it. You can request it by mail, which I did starting September 1st. One can now request it online by the State Board of Elections. So that's a really positive facilitation of this way of voting. And then you can track whether the ballot was received when you mail it back in. You can go online and see that it was received. And starting Friday, there's actually going to be a new tracking system, which will affirmatively send you a text or an email saying it's been received. So the idea that you would then go wait in a long line to vote, an early vote, when you've mailed in your ballot and you know that it was received is very foolish. And it opens up people to criminal liability. And it really troubles me that the president is advising that way. So North Carolina people can vote by mail safely. And then if they want to vote, we have 17 days of early voting. And for the first time, every county has to have weekend voting within those 17 days. And we have election day. So there are going to be so many times for people who want to vote in person to go that they'll be able to spread out, reducing the crowds, reducing the risk of coronavirus. And there's a mask mandate on the workers. We encourage, obviously, everyone who votes to wear a mask, but there'll be sanitation, there'll be distancing requirement. So it should be a very safe way to vote. And we are doing everything in our power to just tell people, look, in North Carolina, it's easy, it's safe, and it's secure. Please vote.
Yeah.
I'll just build on what Josh said, and I echo everything he said. We're also engaged very actively in litigation here in Pennsylvania. You know, the president's campaign, his own campaign, and the RNC have sued us here in Pennsylvania over our relatively new vote by mail law, actually to make it harder for people to vote. Imagine that, Keith Ellison. They're trying to make it harder for people to vote. And, you know, I think that the president did some simple math. They looked at what happened in Pennsylvania back in June. There were 2 million vote by mail ballots requested We're a state of 13 million people. Roughly 6 million people will participate in this election. So that's a lot of people asking to vote by mail. More than 2/3 of them were Democrats. And I think basically what the president's folks did was take a look and said, if we allow that to happen again, we're going to have a really hard time winning Pennsylvania. And, I don't want to speak for Dana, but I think it's going to be a similar dynamic in Michigan as well. So we went back to court. The central argument that the president made was that you can't trust vote by mail here because it's rife with fraud. So we went to the judge, Maura, and said, okay, Mr. President, put up or shut up. Where's all the evidence of fraud? And of course, they produced no evidence of fraud, and the judge stayed the lawsuit. So that's just one piece of litigation. Obviously, we're all working together on the lawsuits against the leadership of the Postal Service to make sure we can get the mail flowing again so these ballots can be received in time. But make no mistake, there are a lot of efforts right now in the courts to stop certain people from being able to vote. And if I can be real about it, here in Pennsylvania, they're not focused on stopping people who look like me from being able to vote. They're focused on stopping people who look like Keith from being able to vote and make it harder for our minority communities to have the opportunity to have their voices heard. And I simply will not stand for that.
Yeah, and just to follow up on that, Josh, when you talk about suppression of minority voters, we've seen that directly in Michigan through these illegal robocalls that have been coming in specifically to the city of Detroit to provide misinformation to people and to scare people out of voting absentee. And these are specifically targeted towards African-American voters. And these robocallers will specifically say, if you vote absentee, if you sign up to vote for to request an absentee ballot from your clerk, that information will be shared with creditors. And that information will be also shared in the event that you have any outstanding warrants. So you can be arrested just for applying to vote absentee. And because absentee voting is totally new to us, for people who aren't seniors or who have other medical issues, people really don't know because they have no experience. They have no frame of reference. People have not voted absentee in the past. And this is their first general election where they can do so. And here they're being threatened that if they dare sign up for an application to vote absentee, that all kinds of terrible things are going to happen to them. And so we've had to be very aggressive in going after that, trying to investigate those cases and to pursue whoever is promulgating those those illegal robocalls. But it's just another way to spread this disinformation that really starts all the way, from the president all the way down, that there is something to fear about voting absentee. And so it is a big concern here for us. And I'm very worried about how that is going to impact the number of people who actually vote, especially in the middle of a pandemic where people don't want to go to the polls because they're afraid.
Yeah, let me just chime in and say that hats off to everything all of you are doing. Just a few quick points. We've been fighting the lawsuits from the right, but also we've been sued. The state of Minnesota has been sued by the the DSCC, and because Minnesota's voting rules conflicted with the Voting Rights Act, our response was to say yes. The Voting Rights Act does preempt the aspects of Minnesota voting law that were pointed out. We entered into a consent decree. We think that's going to allow more people to vote. So that's another aspect of what's going on. Yes, part of the story, much of the story is voter suppression, but there are people trying to figure out how we can get more ballots to people too. Early voting starts on September 18th. We're letting people know that. We think it's a good idea for them to vote by mail. And if they want to go in, then go in on a day where very few people are going to be at the polls. Polls open on September 18th, important to know. And then the other thing that we're dealing with, that we really couldn't stop this, is that we got Kanye West on the ballot for some bizarre reason. This idea that he's there is just sort of some independent guy who wants to run for president, I wouldn't have any problem. That's his right to do. But everybody fighting on him to get him on the ballot is a very conservative operative, well-known in the state of Minnesota. So I'm saying this is not a straight up thing. This is voter suppression of another kind, trying to shave off minute numbers of voters. Most people aren't going to believe that they can't vote because of some of the tricks that we've heard about. But what we're talking about is a small numbers game. Minnesota only beat Trump by 44,000 votes. And they believe that if they can shave a little here and shave a little there, they might get there. But I think that we're going to step up and make sure there's a fair count and a fair vote.
Yeah, well, that's a great note to end on. And I want to thank my colleagues. First, I want to come back and we'll give everybody with the shot clock here, 30 seconds to final thoughts on perspective on this time that we're in. And we'll go in the order that we presented. But second, stay tuned, audience. 3 o'clock, we're going to kick off right at 3 with our great panel, Dean Erwin Chemerinsky, joined by Generals Becerra, James, and Weiser, are going to talk about the Supreme Court reigning supreme, how Democratic AGs are winning and kicking butt, necessarily so, in the Supreme Court. And that'll be great. So stay tuned for that. I just want to close by saying that I am really so proud to be with my colleagues and their teams. I think there has never been a more important time for people to step forward, stand up for the rule of law, stand up for the vindication of basic constitutional rights. I think this time, this double whammy of COVID and what I'll call George Floyd and the racial unrest, the necessary racial unrest, really gives us an opportunity to build forward in new and different ways. And it is my hope that through all the struggle and the pain and the upset, we can get there. I know of no greater leaders to work with than my own Democratic AG colleagues and their teams, but we won't do this alone. We must do this together. So thanks for being part of our conversation today. And I'm going to turn it over to my friend Josh Stein.
Yeah, thanks. This COVID crisis has sort of underscored core functions of what we do as AGs, protecting consumers, so going after price gougers, going after scammers. But it also shines light on the broader role we can play, like dealing with folks' economic hardship. That's not clearly something one would associate with AGs, but it's something that we all care deeply about and are maximizing our authority to try to help people get through this tough time. And so thanks for having the opportunity to address everyone today.
Maura, great to be with you. I'll make it brief. Just everybody stay safe, stay healthy. And thank you for joining us for this. I think it's an important conversation. And as I said this morning in my comments, many of you in your companies, organizations, labor unions have a really important role to play in this process as we heal our nation and as we rebuild. And I thank you for playing a role. Thanks. I'll turn it to Dana.
Yeah, I can't state it any better than you guys just did. Very proud to be part of this team of public servants who have worked so hard to defend the rights of people all across this nation. And again, follow the rule of law, follow science. And I think that our nation's going to be in a much better place, hopefully by January.
Well, I'll just say, look, think about state AGs and how you can partner with state AGs, whether you're trying to make sure we have fair competition, fair wages, whether you're trying to make sure we have a clean environment, or whether you want to fight for democracy and the right to cast a fair ballot. State AGs are an ally of yours. So all the best, and we'll see you soon.
Fantastic. All right. Be well, everybody. Be well. Take good care.
Thanks.
Stay safe.
So,
all right. Thanks,
bye.
guys. Bye-bye.